If you love Review Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Oh, I say, your fame is well-deserved, Spaniard. I don't think there's ever been a gladiator to match you. That, for this young man, he insists. You are Hector reborn. Or was it Hercules? Why doesn't the hero reveal himself and tell us your real name? You do have a name. My name is Gladiator. How dare you show your back to me, slave? You will remove your helmet at once and tell me your name. My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the north, general of the Felix legions, and loyal servant to the true emperor Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next. So that was me. You would never have guessed, as Emperor Commodus and as Maximus as well, as played by Russell Crowe, from the movie Gladiator, of course, which is set in the arena of death, the greatest and most celebrated stage in the whole of history, the Colosseum. I have to say, that film was one of the first great achievements for me of CGI. It was defining cinema. I remember when I went to the movies to watch it, I was so excited about it. It was one of those films that, while watching, I actually felt the ghost of my 10-year-old self sitting next to me, kind of watching it with me in awe at the spectacle that was just unfolding, one adventure after the next. It was actually everything I'd dreamed of seeing on screen, but I never thought that I would. The CGI, though, it was defining because of its artificiality. And that was the whole point. The reproduction of the Colosseum was vastly exaggerated, making it look much bigger than it really was. And yet, that exaggeration actually felt entirely appropriate. Everything about the Colosseum, even now, is about spectacle. It's about illusion. It's about grandeur. And simply reproducing it as it would have been wouldn't have captured its spirit, because it wouldn't have awed the audiences like it did in the 2nd century AD. Are you not entertained? It's all about entertainment. In that way, Gladiator perfectly maps onto how the Colosseum originally functioned. The film dazzled with its spectacle while also kind of unsettling us with, the moral unease of watching people fight to the death for the entertainment of others. Of course, the big difference is that in the film and, what originally happened, of course, we don't feel the same moral anxiety because the film is fictional. But when you look at the original Colosseum and what was staged there, it actually introduces an uneasiness about Rome's history. The Colosseum becomes a symbol simultaneously of cruelty and grandeur, very much like the Roman civilization itself. And yet people still flock to see it. Thousands upon thousands of people every day go to the Colosseum. Mary Beard, the great historian, pointed out that the dark and savage glamour of its violent past is part of its enduring appeal. Tourists today aren't just drawn to the building's architecture, they're actually fascinated by its history of blood and death. So there isn't a real difference, is there, from us now to us then? The duality, its grandeur and its brutality actually makes the Colosseum an enduring emblem of Rome. And it has stood as a symbol of the empire for centuries, even inspiring Byron's famous lines from Childe Harold when he wrote, "While stands the Colosseum, Rome shall stand. When falls the Colosseum, Rome shall fall. And when Rome falls, the world." Of course, Byron actually attributed that to Bede, who was an Anglo-Saxon monk, inaccurately. But the sentiment is the same. It's always been at the very heart of Rome itself. The Colosseum's history reflects the evolution of Rome itself. After it ceased being used for gladiatorial games, it became a cemetery. Then it became a fortress for the Frangipani family. And later, it was even a workhouse for repentant prostitutes under the Renaissance popes. I mean, talk about irony. But by the 18th century, it was a Christian shrine, even though there's no evidence that Christians were ever martyred there at all. And of course, now it's the biggest tourist attraction in Rome. And I think it's the hint of blood in the air. That's what drives people to it. There's a lot of mythology about the Colosseum. Christians, for example, were never fed to the lions there. That's just a myth. Well, let me clarify that. There are absolutely no records that suggest that that happened. And the Byron poem, the saying that I just read to you, isn't quite right either. The original saying that may or may not have come from Bede, was definitely Anglo-Saxon, but it actually referred to the Colossus, the great statue that was built by the Emperor Nero, quite near where the Colosseum was actually built. I think what's fascinating is that the Colosseum wasn't even called that by the Romans. I know. So anyone who listened to my podcast on Pompeii, I also mentioned a guy called Martial, and he was probably Rome's best epigrammist. And he wrote a whole series of poems to commemorate the Colosseum that he calls Amphitheatrium Caesareum, so Caesar's amphitheater. And it was also known as the Flavian Amphitheater, named after Vespasian and Titus Flavian, the dynasty that actually built it. When Titus inaugurated it, it wasn't just about the entertainment. Oh, no. And the reasons why it was built, I think that there are multiple ways of approaching that question. It was a moral and a political statement. And he used the Colosseum to assert Flavian authority and to appease the gods after disasters like, the eruption of Vesuvius and the fire that actually destroyed the Capitol Temple. And the eruption of Vesuvius actually took place 1 year before the Colosseum was built. And when it was built, it was hailed as absolutely extraordinary. Martial compares it to one of the great wonders of the world. He says that no other wonder in the world can compare to this structure. Fame shall speak of one marvel in place of all. And I actually think that he's right. I think the Colosseum is right up there with the Great Pyramid as one of the great, great emblems of antiquity. So one would think that gladiatorial games were the only things that were staged there, but not so. And I think you can safely say that the Romans in particular have always been enthusiastic, or certainly enthusiasts for gladiatorial games, haven't they? I mean, it's when you think about the gladiatorial games, it's very distinctly an Italian thing, isn't it? The games themselves were as much about spectacle as they were about social cohesion. But gladiatorial combat had its origins in funerary rites, offerings as a tribute of armed violence to the spirits of the recently departed. And they were originally staged in the Forum, which is the great central open space between the Palatine and the Capitol Hills, and you can still visit those areas. And of course, over time, this evolved into public entertainment, and these rituals originated along the Bay of Naples, the very place where Mount Vesuvius erupted. And this idea that it is a religious rite is actually very important to understanding the power that gladiatorial combat has on the Roman imagination. Even though the initial role comes to assume entertainment, there is always a sense that it should have a cultic role. And witness to this is a Christian writer by the name of Tantalian, who he's writing in Carthage in AD 200. And he writes, "Back in the myths of time, because the Romans believed that the souls of the dead could be propitiated by the spilling of human blood, they would mark Roman funerals by slaughtering slaves bought cheaply, especially for this purpose. Gradually, it became to seem like a good idea to martyr them by transforming this into a pleasure. And so it was that Romans found comfort for death in open murder." I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that you can take away from that. But I think the most appalling thing is that there were slaves for sale in the marketplace that were just there for slaughter. That's their sole purpose. Now, Tantalian is, of course, writing as a Christian. So, in effect, he's a bit of a hostile witness. But I think that he is actually fixing on something that is there in the Roman attitude towards slaves and gladiatorial combat, which is a certain nervousness about the idea that it should rank as mere entertainment. The sense that these rituals, are sacral rites. The Romans actually call them munaria, but they come to be what the Romans call spectacular, and that's where we get the word, of course, for spectacle or things to be watched. So even when the men are fighting, but now not to just appease the souls of the dead, they still have to find justification for it. To say it's not just entertainment, it's something more than that. They have to. And it became, I think, a way of maintaining social cohesion, a sense of civic Roman identity. Yet the Romans maintained a sense that these games carried a moral and even sacred weight. The violence wasn't just for the crowd's enjoyment. It was actually a reflection of Rome's values and its societal order. The rights to sit and watch the games is something that only a Roman citizen can do. It means that you are a Roman and that you share common values with everyone else there. And by sit, of course, I mean stand. Citizens didn't sit. Under the Republic, senators are actually paranoid by the idea that people sit to watch the spectacular. And of course, the Latin word for sitting is seditio, which is where we get the word sedition. It comes to, signify civil strife and anarchy and all things that fail to maintain order. And the Senate in the 2nd century BC actually made it a law. You cannot sit at a gladiatorial games, you must stand. And if you think about the 1960s, what did John Lennon and Yoko Ono do to protest? They sat. They had a sit-in. What do protesters do today when they're trying to make a point to stop traffic? They sit. And this is where this comes from. So to sit, in Roman words, well, that's committing sedition. And that's a law that's punishable by death. And of course, then, as the empire expands and warfare moves from the limits of Rome to very distant frontiers, there is also a feeling that there is a need to remind the mass of the Roman people what it is that underpins Roman greatness. So even the oath that gladiators swear is actually modeled on the same oath that is taken when you join a Roman legion. So the gladiatorial oath is, I will endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. And that is actually a real amplification of what it takes to serve in the armies of Rome. And keep in mind that the gladiators themselves are slaves. They are not free men. And what I find really interesting about this is that even the Roman elite couldn't resist the lure of the games. Commodus, the emperor famously portrayed in Gladiator, so well done at the beginning of this podcast, actually participated in the arena himself. But get this was actually seen as scandalous. It blurred the lines between the ruler and the entertainer. And he's an entertainer. The games are for the people's entertainment. So Commodus may have believed that fighting in the arena actually connected him with the people. And maybe it did, but it also highlighted his vanity to the people and his desire for adoration. And that was his downfall. So you're not a professional gladiator out of choice. I mean, in the long run, there are notoriously, Commodus being an example, upper class people. The glamour of the gladiator is such that the people who aren't slaves, members of the nobility, even an emperor, wants to partake in the excitement of these games. But they are slaves. They are the lowest of the low, and they're ranked along such dregs of society as prostitutes, and I love this, actors. So that is the measure of just how lowly they rank in the social scale. And I know there's some actors who listen to this podcast, so I apologize in advance, but we're 2,000 years on, and seriously, you guys earn way more money than anyone else will ever earn. So because they're slaves, they can be bought. And obviously, the more money you have, the more slaves you can buy and the bigger display you can put on. And this is actually really important because as we enter the final sector of the Republic, you have ever more warlords dominating the functioning of the Republic. So what you get is an acceleration of anxiety about the great men using gladiatorial combat to promote their image to harvest votes from the people. So unsurprisingly, it's Caesar who kind of blazes this path. So before he becomes consul, while he's still kind of trying to make his way, his father dies and leaves him a very wealthy man. And what Caesar sees is an opportunity to really kind of cut a dash. This is about appeasing the soul of Caesar's father, first and foremost. Keep that in mind, because remember, the games were all about funerary rites. So he gets 320 pairs of gladiators, by far the largest number that had ever fought on one occasion, and he dresses them in silver armor. So this is a complete spectacle. And the Senate, in the wake of, this, actually introduced legislation to try and rein in extravagance like this. Basically, Caesar is using the gladiatorial combat as a vehicle for geopolitical rivalry. And I think that the most intriguing way in which this is manifest is in the fabric of Rome, in that there is no permanent stadium where people can actually go and watch gladiators. So you do get them elsewhere. And of course, the word that describes it is amphitheatrium, and that comes from the Greek. So basically, it means a space that can be viewed from both sides, as opposed to a theater where you can only sit really in a semicircle. Of course, gladiators, they're Italian, and the amphitheater which evolves to stage these displays is also not just Italian, but it becomes internationally the marker of Romanitas. And if you see an amphitheater anywhere in the world, you know that you're in a Roman city. But there isn't, at this stage, a permanent amphitheater in Rome. Instead, the artificiality of the structures that are built, either in the Forum or on the campus marshes, on the outskirts of Rome, are actually part of the crowd's fun. This is part of what ambitious noblemen are actually spending their money on. So that when you actually go and see gladiators, you're actually also going to see an architectural extravaganza because they've built it just for that purpose. And this actually remains a source of constant tension under the Republic. But that, of course, starts to ease once Augustus comes to power and establishes an autocracy. And I think it's really telling that it's only once Augustus seizes power that you get the first permanent amphitheater in Rome. But it's not built by Augustus, interestingly, but by one of his lieutenants. But Augustus continues to build his own kind of spectacles and stages for the display of gladiators, which he puts on in an absolutely unprecedented scale. So Caesar had kind of raised eyebrows by putting on 320 pairs of gladiators. Augustus stages a show that features 10,000 gladiators. And I have to say, that does sound like a suspiciously round figure. And it probably is, a classic Roman exaggeration. I mean, isn't 10,000 Latin for, a lot? And I think what it means is there are so many gladiators you can't count them. And I suspect that Augustus himself says it's 10,000 because this is actually a number that's quoted by Suetonius, who has access to Augustus's records. So at that point, the experience of going to watch the games under Augustus is becoming a little more ordered, a little more regimented, certainly more structured, and definitely more class stratified and so on. So this idea that the display of gladiators is somehow revealing something about the moral character of the Roman people, it doesn't die with the ending of the Republic. In fact, it becomes intensified because Augustus can control the spectacles. Everyone knows that it reflects his vision of Rome. And by this point, spectators are sitting. But Augustus was very, very anxious about the fact that people are just kind of sitting willy-nilly. They're kind of crowding in and sitting wherever the hell they want. And what he feels is that the prawn cocktail kind of eating classes, the senators, the rich, they should have the best seats. And they should be seen to have the best seats by the people. And that the people who actually lack the necessary property qualifications should be shunted to the top. And that this should actually reflect the order of dignity of the way that the Roman people are organized, because the Romans are obsessed, absolutely obsessed, by social stratification. They have this thing called the census, which isn't just about counting, how many Romans there are, but what their property qualifications are, what their moral standing is. You can actually pinpoint your social standing with minute punctiliousness. Augustus is actually very keen on this, and he feels that gladiatorial displays should do exactly that the place of the spectators are sitting should kind of be a census in stone, if you like. He feels the gladiatorial displays should be a kind of lived census. And of course, the people go there in droves, and they know exactly where they should be. But there is also, I think, something that is very, very unique to that Roman autocracy. There's nothing really comparable that I can think of in any other ancient autocracy, which is that the emperor, by staging these displays, is kind of putting his reputation on the line. These displays, they have to be effective. They have to be impressive. He has to be confident, in his own popularity that he will fill the stadium and that nothing goes wrong, because he is a public figure. And it would be absolutely terrible for him to be booed, for instance, when the games start. So that's actually part of the real dynamic that you get in Gladiator, the movie. The question of, are the people going to be siding with Commodus or with Russell Crowe's character? That's the key dynamic that structures the entire plot of that film. And that is absolutely true to the jeopardy that is always kind of shadowing an emperor of Rome, who's putting on these spectaculars. And those spectaculars, they run right through the early emperors, the Julio-Claudian emperors. And there is another example of Claudius. Claudius is not a martial man at all. He's not a military man. He's actually a scholarly man. And he uses the games as a stage on which to pretend that he's a martial man. So he shows up in incredibly form-fitting armor, with six-pack abs and all this kind of stuff. And of course, it's Claudius who gets the famous salute as "Hail Emperor, we who are about to die salute you." And of course, this is recorded by Suetonius. But again, what's fascinating about this is that this is not in the amphitheater. It's in a lake that he is about to drain. And before it gets drained, he decides that he's going to hold a naval spectacle. And all the crowds, of Rome, there's over 1 million people there. They gather around the banks. And when the gladiators actually shout to him, "We who are about to die salute you," he answers, "Well, thank you, but you may not die." I think this is one of those mistakes that an emperor should never make. So all the gladiators kind of look at each other and go, "That's brilliant. We're not going to die." So they all put down their weapons on the assumption that he has just given them a pardon. And of course, he is now furious and says, "No, I haven't." And the gladiators go, "Yes, you have." I mean, it's almost Monty Pythonage, isn't it? You can witness this scene in your head. So Claudius then has to get up from his seat, and because he's a big man, he has to kind of hobble down and harangue them and get them to fight. And of course, the crowds boo him. But this is an example of the potential pitfalls that face an emperor who screws up on the day of the display. This kind of shambles actually shows both the perils that face the emperor. You've actually got to make sure that the spectacle is absolutely right. And it also shows that you still don't have a permanent amphitheater in Rome. Every other city with any pretensions to, being a significant urban space by this point in time actually has their own amphitheater. Rome doesn't. And I think we should take a break here. And when I return, I can chat about the building of the Colosseum, the spectacle of the Colosseum, and all its political and cultural meanings. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So we're now in the rule of the Flavian dynasty, who have taken control after the death of Nero. Now, why does this earmark a change in the attitude towards the gladiatorial games? Well, I think it's because the Flavians are not from an elite background. And so, as a result, they're probably less tied to the assumptions and prejudices that had governed the Julian Claudian emperors. So they kind of think out of the box with regards to that to a greater degree. But there is also a very obvious need to stamp their power, their authority, the existence of their dynasty on the urban fabric of the city. And they're given the opportunity to do that by what Nero, the last of the Julian Claudian emperors, had done in a similar light. So Nero had been emperor during the Great Fire. We hear all these things about him, playing his lyre, while Rome burns. I don't think that was true, but there is a Great Fire, and he's emperor through that Great Fire. And in the wake of the Great Fire, he actually clears away all the rubble, and he builds this kind of, I don't know, it's an enormous pleasure palace that features, a massive house kind of cheesed with gold so that it glints in the sun. And he's also got plans for an enormous colossus, a giant statue, some 200 to 300 feet tall, with his own face. And he wants to build a lake with pleasure gardens all around it. And this is cast by the senatorial elite as being an absolute display of self-indulgence for sure. And of course it is. But they ignore the fact that probably, these parks are open to the mass of people. And the key thing about that is that that there's no social ordering in a pleasure garden. People are just going to go wherever the hell they like. People can just wander in willy-nilly. So when Nero dies and Vespasian Flavian, comes to power, he has every opportunity to get rid of this monument to Nero. And that's exactly what he does. Vespasian's whole shtick is that he's a kind of a rugged, no-nonsense, old-fashioned, hard soldier with no time for pleasure gardens and golden houses. So he starts that process of demolition basically the same day that he takes power. And he moves all the statues and the works of art out from Nero's house, and he puts it in a temple to peace that he has built next to Augustus's forum. And he fills the lake with concrete, completely covers it over. And then there is the question, well, what to do with this vast, empty, concreted space that is probably the most valuable piece of real estate in the world. It's empty. He can do anything he wants. And this is where he gets the idea that he should have an amphitheater. And it's got to be on a scale significantly stupefying that it can basically, seat the mass of the Roman people. I mean, it can't seat all of them because, there's over 1 million people in Rome at this particular stage. But it's got to be large enough that it can adequately symbolize, the presence of the entire mass of the people who live in the city. I then wondered, is there an element, through that, because Nero was building a pleasure garden, and of course, Nero was this populist showman. Is there an element of them having to do something that is A, very showy, and B, that is democratic? Democratic's actually the wrong word, but something that is open to the people rather than something fancy for the senatorial elite. And the answer, I think, is that it's a proclamation. It's doing two things simultaneously. On the one hand, Flavian is saying we're not having any nonsense with pleasure lakes and gold houses and colossus statues. This is good old-fashioned Roman entertainment. It's going to be moral, it's going to be upstanding, it's going to be displays of blood, which will make people better. So it's absolutely part of Roman tradition. And on the other hand, it's saying the Flavians are here, so take note. We are the new dynasty. We can afford this. And we're giving it to you. We're giving it to you, the Roman people. So that's why it's built on the scale that it's built. It's not just about fitting people in. It's about making it a very, very visible statement. So Catherine Well, she's written a brilliant book on the evolution of the amphitheater from its beginnings up to the Colosseum. And she said about the Colosseum, and I'll just quote from her book, that it towered over the Roman cityscape in much the same way that cathedrals later towered over medieval towns. And as cathedrals tell you a lot about the value system of the people in the Middle Ages, so the fact that you have this great monument to sport and spectacle and blood sports tells you a lot about the value system of the Romans. And the extravagance of it is the point, isn't it? And of course, it's an entirely radical new design. So on the outside, it has huge statues completely surrounding the building, hundreds of them. It has different kinds of pillars. It has beautiful large awnings. It is designed to take your breath away. You know, the first time you see it, you literally want people to gasp. And the further benefit of this for the Flavians is that it enables them to remind people, you know, the people who were going there, about the great military triumph of the Flavian dynasty, which is the defeat of the Judeans. And specifically, you know, Titus's capture of Jerusalem. Because what he then does is strip it of its treasures, and these treasures have been paraded through the streets of Rome. Or have they? You know, that's what I love about these kind of stories when you do the deep research. It's not always what it seems. And it seems that that is actually a bit of a sleight of hand, because actually there wasn't much treasure in Judea at all. You know, the Flavians are actually massively exaggerating how much loot they've taken. In fact, the money seems to have come from them raising taxes on the eastern half of the empire. But what the hell? It's all good stuff. It's entertainment. So the Roman word emperor actually comes from the word imperator, which literally means general. So this is Vespasian saying, I am, you know, we are imperatus, we are imperators in the original sense of the word, not as Nero was, you know, a man who never led an army, who sat around reading and eating grapes and, you know, playing the lyre. Not like that man. We're different. So he's actually making a statement about the manliness of the Flavians and the manliness, more importantly, of the Roman people, and on the construction of it. You know, on its design, we actually have no idea who actually designed it or who built it, but it could well have been Judean slaves. You know, they took a huge harvest of slaves from Judea when they captured it, and they would have provided a very easily ready source of manpower to build the Colosseum. And we also know that Vespasian actually sends whole troops of Judean slaves to Nero when he's trying to build his canal through the Isthmus of Corinth, which never actually gets completed because Nero, of course, dies. I think it's pretty clear that Judea is being used as a source of manpower, you know, for big infrastructure projects in Rome. And of course, then comes the question of capacity of the stadium. And I've seen estimates that it sat at around 50 to 80,000 people. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's the equivalent to building a stadium in today's world. And you know how much infrastructure and planning actually goes into that. This was something that was built by the Romans 2,000 years ago, and it's still standing today. So this now comes to the very specific question of why it matters to Titus Flavian, Vespasian's son and heir. So it's probable that the Colosseum is inaugurated by Titus in the summer of AD 80. And as I mentioned to you at the beginning of this podcast, that is about a year after the subject of my previous podcast about the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And that is one of a number of disasters that rocks the reign of Titus. Other disasters include a major outbreak of fire that actually destroys the Pantheon. So this is why the Pantheon, you know, the temple to all the gods, gets rebuilt by Hadrian. You know, it's that great dome building that most tourists go to, you know, in Rome that you would have seen. But it also destroys the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitol Hill, which is the most significant sacred space in Rome. And keep in mind, it had already burned down in the year of the four emperors when Vespasian comes to power in AD 69. And when it burned down for the first time, that had been taken as a terrifying symbol of the wrath of the gods. So you can only imagine what the people are thinking when it burns down for a second time. So the fact that you know Vespasian and Titus have been busy repairing it, and now that it's burnt down again, as I said, this is terrible news for Rome. And of course, at exactly that time, as the stars align, there's an awful plague that ravages Rome. And then you have the eruption of Vesuvius, and the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum are literally entombed in ash. So in Roman eyes, there are huge numbers of people, dead people, who have not been given the funerary rites that they should have been. So potentially there's a lot of very restless ghosts roaming around, and that's not good for these rulers either. So Titus has a need to appease the spirits. And keep in mind also, he is the moral guardian of the empire, not just of Rome, but the actual Roman Empire. And he sees himself very clearly in that role. The other thing you have to know about Titus is that he had a rather bad reputation before he came to power. He was actually head of the Praetorian Guard, the elite imperial bodyguard. And he was also a notorious libertine whose most famous inamorato was a Jewish princess by the name of Berenice. But when he becomes emperor, he tells the population that he's turned over a new leaf. And he tells them that he's a changed man. This sounds like a very familiar political trope, doesn't it? And then he says that he's motivated by one thing and one thing only, that he never wants to pollute his hands with blood ever again. And I have to say, that actually sounds very, very un-Roman to me. We know what the emperors do. But it's also very ostentatious, and I suppose that's very Roman. For instance, he has a habit of lying around at dinner and saying things like, "Oh, my friends, I've wasted a day, for I have done nothing good." I laugh because I often have days like that. So when he inaugurates the Colosseum, he actually rounds up people that he had employed when he was head of the Praetorian Guard, people that he had employed to do terrible things for him, spies, informers, people who had then basically helped him become emperor. And what he does is he has them all arrested and dragged into the arena. There's hundreds of them. And in front of a massive crowd, he has them smashed with cudgels and then lashed with whips. And this is all about making a statement to the people, saying, "I am no longer the man that I was." And the weird thing is that by doing that, he's actually showing them that he is exactly the man that he was. But what he's trying to say is, I'm doing right by the Roman people, but more importantly, I'm doing right by the gods. And it's because of that the seating aspect is so important, because a city in chaos is a city that is going to anger the gods. And that's the last thing they want to do. So Titus is, as Augustus was, absolutely obsessed with everyone having the right place. Senators have to be sitting in the right place. The poor have to be at the top. It's a census that is now carved in stone. So that's the seating. So the seating is organized. So what are people watching? My initial sense of it as a complete outsider, to the subject, someone who, loves the film Gladiator, is that you've got, a bunch of people in chariots. You've got a bloke or a couple of blokes with nets and tridents. You've got other fellows with swords, and you've got a few tigers kind of popping up out of the ground. And that's my view of what takes place there, but on a massive scale. But what's really going on? Keep in mind, these are the greatest spectacles ever staged on Earth. And I think that what Titus is doing, again, it's kind of a repudiation of Nero, and it's an affirmation of the fact that the Roman people have to align themselves with the gods. So what Nero had done when he took to the stage and, played on the lyre or, took a dramatic role, was that he was identifying himself with the heroes of myth. What Titus is doing is basically restating the dimension of myth in the arena, and that in turn, it's to cast him and the Roman people in the role of the gods. And if you think about it, people these days, not me, but, enthusiasts, they do live action kind of role-playing or cosplaying or whatever they call it, where they kind of dress up as gods and heroes, don't they? They dress up as, as Vikings and as characters in Star Wars or Star Trek, and they kind of romp around in the woods and things. And this is actually an ancient version of that social role-playing. So if you think about this, if the Roman people are the gods watching the spectacle of mortals on earth, then the criminals and the slaves who are entertaining them are often cast as the roles of tragic heroes, heroes from myth, and so on. So there isn't a kind of set routine, but the whole point with staging spectaculars is that you kind of mix things up and keep the crowd on their seats, the edge of their seats. But you could say that there is a kind of rhythm that is more obeyed than disagreed, which is that you open with displays of execution of criminals. And again, these are seen by Romans as being an expression of the correct way to do things. Remember, they're funerary rites. So Livy says of the Romans that we may boast above any other people that our methods of punishment are civilized, which kind of may come as a surprise to the rest of us because we tend to think that Roman punishments are actually incredibly uncivilized. But it's important to the Romans that executions affirm a moral order. So what's actually happening in the Colosseum is that this kind of ambition, to make executions affirm a sense that, all is right with the world and it's being fused with a dimension of myth. So in effect, what they're staging, it's a combination of a modern snuff movie with Cirque du Soleil. That's actually the perfect way to describe it, I think. It's capital punishment fused with brilliant stagecraft. So I suppose it's the stagecraft and the spectacle that lifts it to the level of a ritual rather than merely, here's some guy who stole some bread, kind of let's cut his hands off. They make it a spectacular. And of course, Marshall, who I spoke about earlier, actually loves these. And we only know about these punishments, these executions, because Marshall actually writes about them. And for instance, he describes a man who is chained by his wrists and by his ankles, and a bear comes and eats his intestines. So there's actually echoes there of the punishment of Prometheus, whose intestines were actually gnawed by a vulture and an eagle. And there is also a woman who is mounted by a bull. But that again is a story that comes from Greek mythology. It's the story of Pasiphae, the queen who gives birth to the Minotaur. So it's the feeling that the Roman people have entered another dimension, a dimension of mythology that are actually being controlled by Caesar. And they don't view this as pure fancy dress reenactment. No. It's a very sinister and dark reenactment of mythology. There are rituals that, to some degree, occupy space between the natural and the supernatural. This is another reason why the games are so special. And of course, I'm absolutely sure there are just people who love the spectacle of blood. So Claudius was actually notorious for adoring executions. Suetonius is very specific, and he comments on it because it's very unusual. Executions are seen as being a bit vulgar, a bit crass, but these executions are clearly in terms of stagecraft designed to be works of art. So you have the entertainment value, but there is also a sense that, you're in the border zone of the supernatural while you're watching them. And of course, that must make it all the more thrilling. Now, the other thing is that part of the entertainment is hinted at by the presence of a bear, tearing out the intestines. The bear itself actually comes from Caledonia, from what is now Scotland. And by bringing monsters like this from the barbarian reaches that lie beyond the empire, or from the kind of outermost reaches of the empire itself, what the Caesars and emperors are doing is demonstrating the global reach of Roman power to the people. So those animals that are brought to Rome, they're fierce in themselves. I mean, imagine seeing a giraffe or an elephant for the first time. I mean, it's a remarkable spectacle, but there is also a sense of, aren't we great? We can bring all these animals from all over the globe. We are like the gods. So tigers, they get from India. Huge snakes come from India. Elephants are also brought in from India and from Africa. So this is about displaying Rome's global reach. And of course, then you have the gladiators. The gladiators are the climax of the entertainment. This is what people have come to see because it's sport. It's about skill. People will have their favorites for sure. And of course, they will also have that sense that you often, get in sports at its most intense, whether it's boxing or, for cricket fans, fast bowling, aimed at the head, the sense that there's a physical danger. And there's a brilliant account many centuries later It's actually written by Saint Augustine about a friend of his called Alypius, who goes on to become very much like Augustine, actually, a very distinguished kind of Christian bishop and thinker. But he describes how Alypius is very standoffish about the gladiatorial entertainments. He's absolutely not interested in seeing it. And then, of course, he gets persuaded to go and he sits there. His eyes are shut because he doesn't want to watch it. And then Augustine describes how as soon as he actually sees the blood, his eyes are wide open. And he says, and I'll just quote this, "He drank it in with a savage temper, did not turn away, but fixed his eyes on the bloody pastime, drinking in the madness, delighted with the wicked contest, drunk with the bloodlust. He was now no longer the same man who came in, but was one of the mob. He joined his true companions who had brought him there. He looked, he shouted, he was excited, and he took away with him the madness that would stimulate him to come again." And you know what? Although that's about Alypius, I think Augustine is actually writing about himself. So he's writing this in his, confession. And this is the appeal of it. This is the thrill of the violence. And really, I think we fool ourselves if we think that we have outgrown that spectacle. I think if gladiatorial combats were staged today, people would absolutely flock to see them. And we're not that far away from people, watching public hangings. And of course, there are countries in the world where hangings and beheadings and things like that are public, and people fill stadiums just to watch them. But to reiterate, I think that the gladiatorial combats are not just about entertainment. They're not just about the killing and the sport. The role that they're playing as the rites to appease the souls of the dead, this is an important part, I think, of what is going on in the wake of the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And it's kind of manifest in very, very unexpected places. So you get it, for instance, in medical books. So there is the physician of Claudius, for instance, the doctor of Claudius, the emperor, a man called Scribonia Largus. And he describes how some people take a 9th times dosage of a small quantity of liver cut from a fallen gladiator. So a dead gladiator. So in effect, a dead gladiator seems to be good for your health. And of course, the other thing, which again absolutely manifests in Gladiator, is the figure of the gladiator being very, very erotic. So women who actually fancy gladiators are an absolute staple of Roman satire. Juvenal, the greatest Roman satirist, is always going on about it. And it's a kind of constant anxiety of Roman moralists that people will be, sexually attracted to gladiators. And indeed, that's why the Roman noblemen want to be gladiators. And apart from their exotic appeal, I then wondered if gladiators had actual fans. So, in the film Gladiator, when Russell Crowe is called the Spaniard, one of the devices is that the young heir to the empire, who's called Lucius Ferrus, actually has a fixation of the Spaniard. And I wondered if people would have had their favorites. And guess what? They do. Gladiators are the equivalent of super sports stars, and their fans pay a premium to see the best of them. As now, people want to see the best sportsmen in the world, and they pay great amounts of money to do so. So just on the Colosseum, the last gladiatorial fights are mentioned around AD 435 as the Roman Empire starts to fall. Christianity has actually become the state religion of the Roman Empire by this stage. And I then wondered if Christians still go. And of course, the answer is no. I think by and large for Christians, it's not just that these are violent displays of blood, and it's not just that the execution of the slaves is unsettling, because they live in a very violent world. And I think it's also not because it's reminiscent of what the Romans did to Jesus. I think it's the enduring sense that these combats have a sacral significance. If you go there, you're then taking part in a ritual that is designed to appease the dead and gods that you now don't worship. And of course, that's not very Christian. The Colosseum falls into relative disuse, I guess, after the 5th century AD, when Rome itself is on its uppers. Later on, it becomes a castle for the Frankopans, but before that, it's a chapel. But I think the Colosseum is always seen as the emblem of Rome because it's the vastest monument there. That idea that it is the Roman equivalent of a cathedral. It's that kind of great statement in stone of what the city is. And the actual sheer size of it means that it doesn't collapse, when other buildings do. So, even though it's in ruins now, it's still an extraordinary spectacle, isn't it? I mean, it's a huge quarry now, but it's so enormous that even though, chunks of stone have been stolen and taken away, it retains the form that it always had, I think, right up to the present day, and especially if you know its history. And maybe, just thinking about it now, a better analogy of the building is actually, when you think about its shape, it's a bullfighting arena. Yeah, I think that's a better analogy. And there was talk at one point in the Colosseum's history, I think in the early modern period, to turn it into a bullfighting arena. It never happened, but, one of the popes actually wanted to do that. Could have been one of the Spanish popes. So bullfighting, I think, is actually the closest you'll get to what the experience of gladiatorial combat would be in our current day. And for fans of bullfighting, I have to say I'm not, but for fans of bullfighting, it's not just about the violence. It's not even perhaps mainly about the violence. It's about the sportsmanship, the scale, the display of expertise. And I think that that's probably true to a lot of the displays that were put on in the Colosseum. It's both a spectacular story, but it's an unsettling one too, isn't it? Just thinking about the sheer numbers of people who must have died. So to give you an idea, it's estimated that over 400,000 gladiators and 1 million slaves and criminals and over 1 million animals were killed in that particular arena. We'll never know absolutely for sure, but it was a lot. And effectively, they were animals that were butchered to make a Roman holiday, as Lord Byron put it. The scary thing is, and I often think about this, if you went on holiday to Rome and they had brought back gladiatorial games, how many people would go? And I think that's a really difficult one to answer. I mean, I wouldn't go to a public execution because it just doesn't interest me. But I know there's a lot of people who would. And I think it's the fear that most people have is that they don't want to see it. But what if you actually go and you like it and you become addicted to it? The fear isn't that you'll go, I don't think, and that you'll hate it. I think it's the fear that you will go and that you will love it. Thanks for listening in, ladies and gentlemen. It's been great to present this podcast to you as always, and I'll look forward to coming back to you next week as Christmas approaches. Bye for now.